When Congressman Mike Quigley asked FBI Director Kash Patel for one simple number, the answer he received exposed a glaring gap in a nationwide policy. Picture this scenario. You are suddenly told that you must produce documentary proof of your citizenship just to cast a ballot, an essential right you have smoothly exercised for your entire adult life. You are not facing this hurdle because of a crime you committed, nor because you are the target of any personal investigation. Instead, you are facing this because the government insists there is a massive, invisible crisis of non-citizens participating in elections. They claim this unseen threat is so severe and widespread that it completely justifies overhauling how 330 million Americans access the most fundamental pillar of democracy. Now, picture the single individual in charge of investigating those very crimes, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sitting under oath before the United States Congress. When asked to state exactly how many people have actually been convicted of this offense, he is completely unable to provide an answer. The information he lacks is not highly classified, it is not deeply sensitive, and it is not hidden behind walls of national security. It is simply, glaringly unknown. This was no ordinary congressional hearing. It was a vivid, real-time display of what happens when massive legislation is constructed first, with the sheer expectation that the supporting evidence will somehow miraculously appear later. It was a showcase of a sweeping national policy, propped up entirely by a statistic that no official in power could actually produce on demand. This incredibly pivotal moment unfolded inside the chamber of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Mike Quigley looked at Kash Patel and asked a question that demanded a basic numerical answer. It was an inquiry so remarkably straightforward that it practically cut through the intense noise of the room. There was no complicated legal jargon involved, no dense layered intelligence briefing required, and no top-secret appendix needed. It was a direct, unavoidable line drawn between a massive political claim and the demand for hard proof. Quigley simply asked, exactly how many non-citizens have faced convictions for voting in United States elections? The sheer weight of that inquiry was heavily amplified by the dramatic events happening just outside those chamber doors at that very moment. For 3 solid months, the Republican majority had been vigorously advancing the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, commonly known as the SAVE Act. This proposed legislation aimed to rigidly mandate documentary proof of citizenship for anyone registering to vote across the entire country. It represented a monumental fundamental shift, adding a heavy layer of friction on top of an already robust system that utilizes identity checks, residency confirmations, and legally binding attestations signed under the strict penalty of perjury. The rationale driving this massive legislative push was far from subtle. It echoed continuously from press podiums, media interviews, and official government statements, relentlessly reinforcing the narrative that non-citizen voting was a massive, highly underreported emergency that actively threatened the core integrity of American elections. These were not just abstract political talking points thrown around for the cameras. The stakes were incredibly high, as the president had leveraged the fate of the entire Senate legislative calendar on this singular, explosive claim. He made a definitive, explicit declaration that absolutely no other bills would advance until this specific act was signed into law. Government funding priorities, crucial foreign policy measures, and vital domestic programs were all brought to a complete standstill, held hostage by this one underlying premise. However, a premise of that magnitude absolutely demands concrete evidence. In any functioning, logical, legal framework, if a government intends to impose a sweeping nationwide mandate demanding that every single voter produce citizenship documentation, political rhetoric is simply not enough. You need actual court cases, undeniable patterns, and concrete numbers that clearly illustrate the massive scale of the problem. You need empirical data that forcefully elevates mere suspicion into undeniable proof. This is exactly where the Federal Bureau of Investigation enters the picture. The FBI is not a public relations firm, nor is it a political messaging arm. It is the premier investigative agency uniquely tasked with constructing federal cases, painstakingly gathering hard evidence, and securing the prosecutions that the Department of Justice ultimately records as formal convictions. If American elections were truly suffering from a widespread criminal epidemic, the FBI would be the primary institution capable of measuring that phenomenon. Sitting right there in the witness chair was Kash Patel, the director of the FBI. He was the one individual who absolutely should have had that specific statistic committed to memory before he even stepped foot into the hearing room. His agency would serve as the central enforcer of the very legislation being aggressively pushed through the halls of Congress at that exact moment. Representative Mike Quigley fully grasped the profound gravity of the situation. Before uttering a single word, he had spent nearly 2 hours silently observing the hearing's progression. He did not interrupt, nor did he aggressively attempt to manufacture a viral moment. He simply watched closely how the witnesses meticulously constructed their answers and artfully dodged direct inquiries. He observed the standard political maneuvering, how they would pivot, eagerly defer to others, and rely heavily on sweeping generalizations. He listened to rehearsed responses that sounded incredibly comprehensive, but were utterly devoid of any measurable, factual substance. Therefore, when it was finally Quigley's turn to speak, he didn't rely on dramatic theatrics or drop a massive binder full of documents on his desk. He brought a cold, undeniable calculation. Quigley reasoned that if the absolute head of the FBI could not articulate the number of non-citizens convicted of voting, then every single public declaration about the massive scale of this threat was floating in a void, completely lacking a quantifiable foundation. If the director could not clearly state the number of active, ongoing investigations, then the frantic urgency surrounding this issue became entirely impossible to verify. And if both of those statements were undeniably true, it meant the proposed legislation was operating inside a complete, factual vacuum. This was the precise analytical framework Quigley carried with him as he delivered his pivotal question. "Director," he asked smoothly, "how many non-citizens have been convicted for voting in United States elections?" Kash Patel's response was incredibly swift, which ultimately made it all the more revealing. He immediately stated that the official conviction statistics reside with the Department of Justice. That single rehearsed sentence accomplished two things simultaneously. Technically, it was an accurate statement, as the DOJ is indeed the ultimate custodian of official conviction records. However, what he crucially omitted was far more important. His reply completely failed to answer the actual question. It offered zero numerical data and smoothly deflected massive accountability away from the very agency responsible for generating the criminal cases that result in those DOJ statistics. Quigley, however, absolutely refused to let that deflection stand. He instantly tightened the parameters of his inquiry, deliberately cutting off Patel's rhetorical escape route. He calmly acknowledged his understanding that the DOJ maintains the official records. He then rephrased his demand, asking Patel directly, in his capacity as the FBI Director, whether he personally knew the number. With that brilliant shift, the conversation was no longer about bureaucratic record-keeping. It transformed into a glaring spotlight on competence, deep preparedness, and ultimate accountability. This high-stakes congressional hearing was not a sudden, overnight event. It had been formally and publicly scheduled a full 3 weeks in advance. Comprehensive briefing materials had been painstakingly compiled. Staff members had eagerly gathered pertinent data, and the most critical issues had been thoroughly mapped out. Furthermore, the topic of non-citizen voting was not some obscure, trivial footnote. It was arguably the single most prominent domestic law enforcement narrative being deployed to passionately justify a massive piece of federal legislation. Consequently, when Patel finally admitted, "I don't have that number with me," the gaping informational hole became glaringly obvious. It wasn't concealed or ambiguous in any way. It was painfully visible for all to see. Quigley pressed the issue once more, but this time he brilliantly expanded the context so that every person in the chamber and every citizen watching the broadcast could track his flawless logic step by step. He forcefully reminded the director that he had prepared extensively for this hearing. He pointed out that professional staff had assembled detailed briefing books for this exact occasion, and that this specific issue had dominated the center of the legislative agenda for 3 entire months. Then Quigley delivered the rhetorical strike that elevated the situation from a mere forgotten detail into a catastrophic collapse of evidence. He highlighted the profound absurdity that the FBI director had arrived to testify that day, completely unaware of the conviction rate for the very crime the pending legislation was explicitly written to prevent. This wasn't empty theatrical rhetoric. It was a masterclass in structural interrogation. It demonstrated exactly how to apply crushing pressure within a hearing without ever needing to raise your voice. Moving forward methodically, Quigley posed his second targeted question. He asked Patel to disclose the exact number of active FBI investigations currently looking into non-citizen voting. This is exactly where the informational void expanded even further. Even if one generously forgives a leader for not memorizing historical DOJ conviction totals, it is entirely reasonable to expect the head of the investigative arm to know the sheer volume of cases they are currently pursuing. Patel responded defensively, stating that they generally have a number of ongoing investigations concerning individuals nationwide, but he did not have that exact number on hand. He merely reiterated that he had a number of them. A number. Not the precise number, just a number. Quigley echoed the phrase back to him, entirely devoid of sarcasm or fake outrage, but armed with surgical precision. He clarified the director's stance for the room. The FBI has a number of active investigations, yet shockingly cannot specify how many. At this point, Quigley's logical trap was fully, inescapably set. Step 1. Absolute lack of a conviction number. Step 2. Absolute lack of an investigation number. All that remained on the table was pure, unmeasured assertion. The atmosphere of the hearing then shifted dramatically into a meticulous, prosecutorial mode. Quigley executed a brilliant maneuver by introducing an entirely external set of data. His goal wasn't merely to score points or win a debate, but to firmly establish a factual, undeniable baseline. He held up a single, printed sheet of paper. It did not originate from a liberal think tank or a Democratic advocacy group fiercely aligned with his own party. The document was produced by the Heritage Foundation, a deeply prominent conservative organization whose research is frequently and repeatedly weaponized to champion massive election integrity initiatives. This was an institution that fundamentally aligned in nearly every way with the very policy direction currently being aggressively pushed. Quigley held the paper up just long enough for the broadcast cameras to clearly register the heading. According to their very own conservative data, Quigley stated calmly, there had been exactly 77 documented instances of non-citizen voting in the United States spanning the last 24 years. Just 77. Not 77,000. Not even 700. It was a mere 77 isolated cases spread across nearly a quarter of a century. In a vast nation home to hundreds of millions of people, where billions of legal ballots have been cast over that massive time frame, the highly touted threat boiled down to an average of roughly 3 single cases per year. The juxtaposition was absolutely staggering. On one side of the room stood a relentless legislative crusade, powerful enough to halt the entire calendar of the United States Senate, entirely fueled by hyperbolic claims of a massive, underreported crisis. On the other side sat the most exhaustive, comprehensive dataset ever compiled by a conservative powerhouse, revealing fewer than 100 actual violations over 2.5 decades. Quigley didn't preach, editorialize, or overstate the facts. He merely read the stunning statistic into the official public record. He then asked the pivotal question that transformed this simple data point into a massive test of the FBI's credibility. Did the director truly believe the Heritage Foundation's figure was accurate? At this incredibly tense juncture, Patel faced 3 distinct choices. He could agree with the data, he could forcefully counter it with a higher, factual figure, or he could simply decline to assess it. Instead, he forged a completely disastrous fourth path. He replied that he believed their estimation was low. That single utterance was the ultimate pivot point of the entire hearing. The conversation had officially abandoned the solid realm of data and numbers, entering the incredibly murky, unstable territory of personal opinion regarding scale. Patel believed the real number was lower than 77, or perhaps much higher, but he had absolutely zero concrete data to offer. He couldn't provide an alternate statistic, he couldn't define a potential range, and he couldn't point to a single opposing dataset to challenge the paper right in front of him. In that critical moment, the room was left with an evidentiary void, filled entirely by blind belief. This is exactly where the foundational logic of the proposed legislation began to fiercely crack and strain. You cannot construct a sweeping, historic piece of national legislation based purely on a feeling. It absolutely demands undeniable proof. Yet, the primary official tasked with gathering that vital proof had just confessed to Congress that his hands were completely empty. Once that stark reality was exposed, once the chamber fully realized that what was being offered was not hard data, but mere belief, the entire underlying logic of the policy started to collapse under its own hollow weight. While a strong personal belief might be great for justifying a political talking point, it fundamentally fails to justify placing a heavy, nationwide mandate on the shoulders of every single eligible voter in the country. To do so violently crosses a sacred boundary that separates objective law enforcement from subjective partisan assumption. Quigley didn't rush to capitalize on this massive revelation. He allowed the heavy silence to amplify the moment, letting the words "I believe that estimation is low" suspend in the tense air just long enough for their terrifying implications to fully settle. Patel's admission wasn't just a display of minor uncertainty. It was a deeply unstable display of supreme confidence, completely untethered from measurable reality. And within the walls of a congressional hearing room, projecting immense confidence while possessing absolutely zero measurement is not a show of strength. It is a massive, glaring vulnerability. From this point forward, the interrogation grew exponentially sharper. Quigley wasn't raising his voice to a shout. His exactness was his chosen weapon. He was no longer trying to pull a number from Patel. He was meticulously illustrating to the world that the number simply did not exist. He was carefully crafting an airtight public record, showcasing not only what the FBI director knew, but crucially, what he did not know yet, continued to boldly claim anyway. The process became almost purely clinical. Every new step firmly reinforced the previous one, severely narrowing the conversational space Patel had left to maneuver. Whenever Patel desperately reached for broad bureaucratic language, Quigley forcefully dragged him back to the harsh light of specifics. And every time Patel leaned on dense institutional phrasing, Quigley brutally stripped it down to individual accountability. Quigley calmly restated the director's position, not as an aggressive challenge, but as a matter of indisputable fact for the congressional record. Patel believed the heritage number was too low. Then, Quigley added the devastating missing piece that morphed that personal belief into a glaring institutional failure. But you cannot tell us what the number is. This highlighted a profound, unignorable contradiction. It wasn't a petty clash between political parties or opposing ideologies. It was a direct, fatal collision between baseless assertion and hard evidence. In any legitimate investigative framework, especially one that culminates in serious federal prosecutions, the scale of a crime is absolutely paramount. Scale must not exist in the abstract. It must be defined in measurable, undeniable terms. These are the exact terms that dictate the allocation of federal resources, set enforcement priorities, justify legislative necessity, and ultimately determine the heavy burden placed upon the American public. If an alleged threat is truly pervasive and widespread, it absolutely necessitates a sweeping, systemic response. Conversely, if a threat is exceptionally rare, it demands surgical precision, not massive, intrusive expansion. Yet, sitting right at the center of this crucial hearing was a terrifying claim of a massive, widespread threat, utterly lacking a defined scale, a documented range, or a quantifiable baseline. And this devastating lack of evidence was coming directly from the exact agency uniquely tasked with defining it. Quigley then executed a brilliant, subtle pivot, broadening the scope from a single missing statistic to a much larger philosophical framework regarding evidence. He seamlessly connected the current tense exchange to a seemingly unrelated topic discussed much earlier in the session: Russia. Earlier that day, Patel and other intelligence leaders were explicitly asked if they ever take foreign adversaries at their word, particularly concerning Russian denials about sharing critical targeting intelligence with Iranian forces. The collective response from the intelligence community was a resounding, consistent, and completely unambiguous no. It is a foundational, non-negotiable pillar of intelligence operations never to blindly trust the word of an adversary. The golden rule is absolute. You verify, you deeply corroborate, and you vehemently reject any claims lacking concrete proof, especially when those claims carry massive strategic consequences. Quigley skillfully retrieved that golden principle and brought it back into the room. But this time, he turned the powerful lens inward. He aimed it directly at domestic policy, challenging the massive claims being made not by foreign adversaries, but by the American administration itself. With a composed, highly measured tone, he reminded the director of his earlier assertion that intelligence operations categorically do not take foreign adversaries at their word. He paused just enough to anchor that powerful standard into the record. Then, he struck. He asked if it was also a foundational tenet of FBI operations not to build massive legislative priorities around sweeping claims that the agency itself cannot independently verify. This was not a mere rhetorical flourish. It was a devastating, direct application of the government's own logic against itself. If the FBI completely refuses to accept a foreign enemy's denial at face value without hard proof, logic firmly dictates they should equally refuse to accept their own side's aggressive assertions without hard proof. This is especially true when those domestic assertions are being heavily weaponized to fundamentally alter the structural architecture of how American elections operate. Cornered, Patel quickly retreated to his final safe harbor, the dense, comforting language of institutional process rather than hard numbers. He recited a rehearsed line, proudly claiming that the FBI supports its critical law enforcement mission with the best available evidence, and insisted their ongoing investigative work accurately reflects the true scope of any relevant threat. It was a sentence desperately designed to sound complete and authoritative. Yet, if you listened closely to what it cleverly omitted, the void remained. There was still absolutely no number. There was no estimated range. There was no formal acknowledgement of the 77 cases, nor any data-driven contradiction of that number with an alternative data set. It was merely an empty, rehearsed pivot back to procedural rhetoric. Quigley absolutely refused to interrupt, argue, or escalate the tension in the room. Instead, he acted as a brilliant, calm translator. He plainly stated that the absolute best available evidence currently before them was exactly 77 cases over 24 years, sourced directly from the most thorough database the conservative movement has ever produced. He then laid Patel's highly evasive statement right next to that cold, hard fact. He summarized, "The FBI director personally believes that number is low, but is entirely incapable of stating what the correct number actually is." This technique was pure, devastating evidence stacking. Quigley wasn't frantically adding new facts. He was perfectly aligning the existing ones until the glaring chasm between them became completely impossible for anyone to ignore. On one side of the scale sat a meticulously documented historical data set. On the other side sat an unsupported, vague, personal belief. And suspended precariously between these two extremes was a massive piece of pending legislation that would aggressively force every single American to produce documentary proof of their citizenship just to register to vote. At this critical juncture, the hearing transcended a mere tense exchange between two men. It exposed a massive structural flaw in how the government justifies its grandest actions. What was on full public display wasn't just a director suffering a gap in knowledge. It was a profound, terrifying gap in justification. And this specific gap carries immense, real-world consequences that stretch far beyond the walls of the committee room. Consider the harsh, practical reality of what this proposed mandate actually means. It means that everyday citizens who have legally and faithfully voted for decades could suddenly be aggressively interrogated and asked to produce vital documents they may not have readily available. It means local administrative systems would be completely overwhelmed, forced to endlessly process and painstakingly verify millions of documents at an entirely unprecedented scale. This translates directly into agonizing delays, wrongful rejections, rampant clerical errors, and severe democratic barriers that simply never existed before. And every single ounce of this chaotic friction is being heavily justified by a so-called threat that, according to the only actual number placed on the table so far, amounts to a statistical average of 3 incredibly rare cases per year nationwide. This highlighted a deeply troubling moral contrast sitting squarely at the center of the moment. On one hand, you have millions of completely lawful American voters being subjected to stringent new hurdles to aggressively prove their inherent eligibility in entirely new ways. On the other hand, the justification for these hurdles is based on a tiny handful of violations scattered incredibly thin over multiple decades. And the singular individual appointed to bridge that massive logical gap with concrete evidence could not provide even a shred of it. Quigley powerfully leaned into this profound imbalance, letting the unadorned facts do all the heavy lifting. He didn't need to dramatize the moment. He physically arranged the two items on the table before him, the Heritage Foundation's stark analysis placed perfectly right alongside the sweeping legislative citation. He physically aligned the administration's bold claim directly against its total lack of justification. Then, he delivered the definitive question that tightly pulled the entire narrative together. He asked, point blank, if Congress should blindly accept the administration's dramatic assertions about the incredible scale of non-citizen voting without a shred of evidence, especially when the director of the FBI himself cannot produce a single supporting number. That piercing question wasn't just directed at Kash Patel. It was a monumental challenge issued to every single member of Congress sitting in that room. It was a direct appeal to every senator preparing to cast a historic vote. It was a loud wake-up call to every citizen watching the broadcast, trying desperately to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what the government was attempting to impose upon them. And true to standard political form, what followed was not a substantive answer, but yet another frustrating avoidance. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, seated directly beside Patel, quickly shifted the dialogue into vague, feel-good generalities about election integrity being a top priority. Patel chimed in, stubbornly reiterating his rehearsed line that the FBI's ongoing work would ultimately speak for itself. But again, if you listened to what was painfully missing, the silence was deafening. There was no statistic, no clarification, no factual correction. It was simply the absolute reinforcement of the exact same deeply flawed pattern. Loud assertion completely divorced from any real measurement. Quigley intelligently chose not to press them any further. This wasn't because he had run out of insightful questions to ask, but because he knew the well was completely dry. There was absolutely nothing left to extract. The terrifying absence of data had already been completely and thoroughly demonstrated. The official record had already been flawlessly built, and aggressively pushing further would not magically produce new information. It would only invite a repetition of the exact same empty evasions. Instead, Quigley executed a far more devastating maneuver. He summarized the reality of the situation for history. "Let me put this in the record," he boldly declared. The phrasing was crucial because this was no longer a polite conversation. It was a formal act of binding documentation. He stated the undeniable facts clearly. The President of the United States is actively blocking all Senate legislation until this specific bill is passed. The administration has been loudly claiming that American elections are hopelessly plagued by foreign voters. Yet, the director of the FBI absolutely cannot say how many non-citizens have been convicted. He absolutely cannot say how many investigations are currently active. And he stubbornly believes the most comprehensive conservative database is low, entirely without providing a single alternative number to prove it. Every single sentence Quigley spoke was an undeniable, rock-solid receipt. Every line was entirely verifiable within the strict confines of that hearing and the larger, chaotic political moment. And when he finally finished his devastating summary, he completely stopped looking at Patel. He turned his gaze directly toward the broadcast cameras. Because at that exact point, the only audience that truly mattered was no longer sitting inside that stuffy committee room. He reminded everyone watching that the Senate was scheduled to vote on this massive legislation that very day. He passionately declared that the American people were completely entitled to know the exact evidentiary base for what they were being aggressively asked to accept. This was the ultimate, inescapable closing argument for this segment of the hearing. It wasn't overly emotional or cheaply theatrical. It was purely, devastatingly structured. And the moment the hearing adjourned, the ripple effects began almost immediately outside the room. The staggering statistic 77 cases in 24 years began flashing rapidly across television screens, dominating viral graphics and leading prominent news headlines. Its immense power lay in its concrete simplicity. It stood in stark, undeniable, direct contrast to the catastrophic magnitude of the administration's sweeping claims. The video clip of Kash Patel awkwardly admitting, "I have a number of investigations. I don't have that number with me," began to circulate wildly. It didn't spread because it was a moment of high drama, but because it was a moment of profound, crystalline clarity. And in the chaotic realm of politics, pure clarity travels incredibly fast. Soon, within the quiet, powerful offices of the Senate, on both sides of the partisan aisle, the exact same unavoidable question began to surface. It wasn't framed in the dense, procedural language of committee hearings. It was framed in the plain, blunt language of the American voter. If this is truly the massive threat you claim it is, Why exactly do we need this extreme law? This hearing ultimately generated something far more powerful than a simple conclusion. It birthed a monumental question that no politician could easily dismiss. The logic was inescapable. If this nationwide crisis is real, immediately show us the number. If the number simply cannot be shown, then what exactly is being used to violently justify this extreme response? And most crucially, who is the exact person that carries the heavy burden of the government's staggering uncertainty? These vital questions completely refuse to remain trapped within the dry lines of a transcript or confined to a brief, fleeting clip on a news segment. They expanded rapidly outward into something far more historically consequential. Because the fundamental truth is this: once a government demands that its citizens blindly accept new burdens, strict new requirements, and complex new layers of verification, providing a concrete justification for those burdens ceases to be an internal, private assumption. It becomes a profound, non-negotiable public obligation. A government absolutely does not get to casually impose massive friction on a core constitutional right based on a vague belief that it completely fails to quantify. Doing so fundamentally erodes something far deeper than mere policy. It severely damages the foundational bedrock of trust that allows any democratic system to function in the first place. Voting is not merely an abstract concept debated endlessly by politicians. It is a tangible, vital, lived action carried out by millions of ordinary people who desperately rely on the system to be exceptionally fair and easily accessible. When that democratic system is abruptly altered and heavy new barriers are aggressively introduced, the negative impact is never, ever distributed evenly. The crushing burden inevitably falls the absolute hardest on those who already have the least flexibility, the poorest access to vital documentation, and the absolute smallest margin for administrative error. This isn't fear-mongering speculation. It is the proven, historical reality of how massive administrative systems always behave. Whenever a bureaucracy radically expands its strict requirements, it inevitably creates new, rigid thresholds. And thresholds, by their very design, always end up entirely excluding someone. Therefore, the true beating heart of this viral exchange transcended Kash Patel, Mike Quigley, or even the SAVE Act itself. It struck directly at the very core of what standard of evidence a government must definitively meet before it is permitted to permanently alter the conditions under which a free citizen exercises their constitutional rights. What Quigley meticulously exposed, entirely without cheap theatrics, is that the evidentiary standard being applied to this massive domestic overhaul completely failed to match the rigorous standard the government proudly claims to uphold in almost every other crucial domain. He brilliantly highlighted the glaring hypocrisy. When the topic shifted to foreign intelligence earlier in that exact same hearing, the operational standard was crystal clear and almost entirely rigid in its clarity. You absolutely do not accept claims without rigorous verification. You emphatically do not build massive conclusions on completely untested assertions. You categorically do not take an adversary at their word when the global stakes are high. This principle is strictly non-optional. It is deeply embedded, heavily trained, and rigorously enforced in how intelligence work is conducted. Yet, the very moment the intense conversation shifted away from foreign threats and onto a domestic policy that directly impacts American voters, that rigid standard suddenly appeared to dangerously loosen. It bended to accommodate something vastly less concrete. It relied not on documented, undeniable evidence, but entirely on loudly repeated political assertion. That is the staggering inconsistency Quigley forcefully dragged into the open, not by wildly accusing anyone, but by perfectly aligning their own statements until they brutally contradicted each other entirely on their own. On one hand, you have a fierce refusal to trust unverified claims from foreign adversaries. On the other hand, you have a terrifying willingness to blindly advance equally unverified claims as the sole basis for massive nationwide legislation. This wasn't merely a minor partisan squabble. It was a devastating, fatal, logical contradiction. And once this contradiction was dragged into the unforgiving light, it became completely impossible to ignore. It raised a monumental question that goes far beyond this specific voting issue and cuts deeply into the fundamental structure of American governance itself. What exact threshold of proof is required before the government can unilaterally impose harsh new conditions on its citizens? Not in political theory, but in harsh, everyday practice. Because right here, in this highly publicized hearing, the necessary threshold appeared to have terrifyingly shifted away from solid evidence to vague inference. It moved drastically from concrete data to personal belief, and from quantifiable, undeniable facts to generalized, unverified concern. This dangerous shift carries immense consequences. It means that the heavy, crushing burden of uncertainty does not stay safely contained within the halls of the government. It is aggressively transferred directly onto the public. It is entirely absorbed by the individual voter, who must now frantically navigate a maze of additional requirements, dig up extra documentation, and survive heightened, intense scrutiny. And they must do all of this to satisfy a government mandate built entirely to combat a so-called threat that has not been clearly defined in any measurable terms. This represents a horrific, glaring moral asymmetry. The government confidently grants itself the absolute luxury of operating on an entirely undefined scale of risk, while simultaneously forcing its everyday citizens to comply with rigidly defined, zero-tolerance conditions of compliance. One side gets to play in the comfortable realm of vague approximation, while the other side is brutally forced to deal in absolute proof. This blatant moral imbalance is fundamentally unsustainable if the governing system expects to maintain any shred of legitimacy in the eyes of the public. True, enduring legitimacy does not magically stem from raw authority or political posturing. It stems directly from unwavering consistency. It requires the strict application of standards that do not conveniently shift depending on who is making the bold claim or who is unfortunately affected by it. If hard numbers and concrete evidence are absolutely required to verify a threat overseas, they must be equally required to justify a massive domestic policy. If solid numbers are absolutely necessary to properly assess risk abroad, they must be completely necessary to assess risk right at home. Otherwise, the critical line separating objective analysis from political narrative begins to dangerously blur. And once that vital line blurs, public trust slowly but inevitably begins to erode. It doesn't vanish entirely all at once in a single dramatic moment, but it decays gradually. It rots through a steady stream of repeated instances, where the public is aggressively ordered to blindly accept vast conclusions completely unsupported by visible, quantifiable evidence. This is precisely what makes this specific hearing so historically significant. The hearing wasn't significant because it finally produced a definitive, satisfying answer, but precisely because it brilliantly exposed the total, terrifying absence of one at the absolute most critical juncture of the decision-making process. Quigley powerfully took the heavy burden of proof and firmly shifted it right back where it belonged. He placed it squarely back onto the dramatic claim itself, back onto the politicians advancing it, and back onto the massive question that had stubbornly not been answered. How many? Because absolutely everything hinges entirely on that one number. The true scale of the threat, the absolute necessity of the massive response, and the basic proportionality of the law all violently collapse without it. Without that crucial number, the entire legal structure is revealed to be resting on nothing more than a flimsy assumption that has not been verified in the rigorous way the government itself defines verification in absolutely every other context. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a catastrophic foundational gap. You could hear this massive failure echoing in the carefully constructed, incredibly empty language used by the defense. Frantic reliance on phrases like ongoing investigations and best available evidence are perfectly designed linguistic tricks that signal vigorous activity without ever specifying true scope. They project effort without defining a single outcome, and motion completely devoid of measurement. While these phrases are not entirely meaningless, they are woefully, terrifyingly incomplete. When they are cynically used as a substitute for concrete, hard data, they function far less as real answers and more as desperate placeholders. They are temporary, hollow structures desperately trying to fill a massive void where something far more definitive and real is expected. Quigley brilliantly recognized these rhetorical tricks instantly. Rather than screaming at them and trying to forcibly dismantle those placeholders directly, he coldly and simply contrasted them with the harsh reality of what should be there instead. He demanded a number, a range, a meticulously documented figure that firmly anchors the entire discussion in something entirely tangible. He demonstrated that when that crucial anchor of concrete data is entirely missing, absolutely everything else begins to drift uncontrollably. The bold political claims drift, the legislative justifications drift, and the sweeping policy mandates built on top of them drift. The nation is suddenly left with a massive legal framework precariously suspended over a bottomless evidentiary gap. This is the exact moment where the hearing transitioned from sharp analysis to terrifying implication. Because once you successfully identify that massive gap, you are immediately forced to ask, what exactly is filling it? Is it unchecked assumption? Is it raw political pressure? Is it a highly partisan narrative that has dangerously gained unstoppable momentum without ever being fully tested against available real-world data? Quigley didn't even need to answer that terrifying question directly. He did something infinitely more effective. He left it completely open. He ensured it was meticulously documented, permanently attached to incredibly specific statements and glaringly specific omissions. He left a crystal-clear trail of flawless logic, so that anyone examining the official record could easily trace the undeniable reality themselves. And that is precisely what makes the moment so historically durable. It doesn't rely on partisan spin or subjective, biased interpretation. It is firmly built upon exactly what was stated under oath, and more importantly, what was spectacularly, undeniably absent. The massive absence wasn't vaguely implied, it was aggressively demonstrated. The director of the FBI completely failed to provide a single number. He utterly failed to provide an estimate. He entirely failed to provide a range. The absolute best he could provide was a mere belief, and that vague belief is now forever etched into the official congressional record, desperately trying to prop up a massive legislative push that is demanding one of the most severe alterations to voter registration requirements in an entire generation. This undeniable connection is exactly what elevates this entire spectacle from a dry procedural exchange into a massive substantive crisis. It brilliantly ties the internal flawed logic of a committee hearing directly to the catastrophic external consequences of a massive policy decision. It directly links empty words to severe action, hollow statements to restrictive laws, and vague beliefs to rigid requirements violently imposed on millions of ordinary people. Once that powerful link is firmly established, it becomes entirely impossible to treat the hearing as an isolated event, or as just another boring moment in a long, endless series of political questions and answers. It permanently becomes part of the critical evidentiary chain that heavily informs how the voting public will ultimately evaluate the true legitimacy of the law itself. When everyday people are suddenly ordered to fully comply with massive new rules, they naturally demand to know the actual reason behind them. They look desperately for the concrete justification that clearly explains why those rules exist, why they are deemed absolutely necessary, and whether the incredible burden is truly proportionate to the actual problem they are meant to forcefully address. If that crucial justification is incredibly unclear, if the problem remains entirely undefined, and if the scale is completely unmeasurable, public compliance devolves into something else entirely. It becomes a forced obligation, completely devoid of understanding. It becomes a blind acceptance without a shred of clarity. Over time, that kind of forced, blind acceptance becomes incredibly harder to sustain. This isn't because citizens inherently hate rules in general, but because they inherently and deeply distrust rules that completely fail to appear grounded in verifiable, undeniable evidence. This represents the true, chilling, long-term implication of what unfolded in this specific hearing. It wasn't just a single fumbled answer or a fleeting viral moment. It highlighted a deeply concerning, systemic pattern in modern governance. It fully exposed a toxic pattern where massive claims are broadcast at maximum volume, while the actual evidence remains entirely undefined. A terrifying pattern where sweeping legislation aggressively advances, while the hard data that supposedly justifies it remains either incredibly incomplete or entirely unavailable. A pattern where the massive burden of proof entirely shifts away from the powerful government and violently crashes down onto the public. Once this toxic pattern is laid entirely bare, it inevitably forces a monumental, unavoidable final question. If the government is completely incapable of quantifying the crisis it demands you fear, what exactly are they demanding you believe? Once that massive question powerfully enters the official record, it absolutely does not gracefully fade out when the hearing abruptly ends. It aggressively follows the political claim everywhere it goes, permanently attaching itself to every single statement, every frantic defense, and every consequential vote. Unanswered questions of this magnitude do not just peacefully disappear. In a system that relies entirely on public accountability, they rapidly accumulate immense pressure. They linger, they wait in the shadows, and they inevitably return. This is absolutely no longer about whether Kash Patel simply suffered a brief lapse in memory. This is a terrifying glimpse into what happens when a powerful government aggressively advances a policy impacting millions, while the underlying problem completely remains utterly undefined at the very highest levels of federal enforcement. It is not merely unclear, it is totally, terrifyingly undefined. There is a massive, unbridgeable difference between simply not having the exact, precise figure directly in front of you and being entirely incapable of establishing even the basic boundaries of the problem you are furiously describing. One is a minor administrative lapse, the other is a catastrophic structural weakness. What Quigley masterfully exposed was not a temporarily missing statistic. He laid bare the complete, terrifying absence of a measurable boundary. Without that firm boundary, absolutely everything expands uncontrollably. Threat descriptions balloon into hysteria, political justifications morph into whatever is wildly convenient, and public requirements become increasingly, uncomfortably invasive. And none of it can be properly or rationally evaluated because there is absolutely nothing anchoring the dramatic claim to a single fixed point in objective reality. That is the exact moment this stops being a mundane policy discussion and rapidly becomes a severe, critical issue concerning the standard of proof. In any other rational domain, whether it be complex criminal law, high-level intelligence, or critical national security, you absolutely do not wildly escalate your response without first definitively establishing the scale of the threat. You entirely refuse to deploy vast resources without tightly defining the exact scope. You unequivocally do not impose heavy burdens without rigorously demonstrating absolute necessity. Yet, in this specific hearing, that entire logical sequence was dangerously entirely reversed. The heavy, crushing burden was thrust upon the public first, with the vague promise that the supporting justification would hopefully, eventually follow. The crucial measurement was entirely, lazily deferred. That inverted sequence carries a profound, massive human cost. When reckless policy violently outpaces concrete proof, the chaotic fallout is never, ever theoretical. It lands aggressively and specifically on real people facing real, stressful situations. Ordinary citizens are not operating in an abstract political vacuum. They are suddenly forced to desperately wrestle with obscure documents, impossible deadlines, unforgiving verification systems, rampant errors, and brutal denials. A single missing piece of paper, a minor clerical mismatch in ancient records, or a simple bureaucratic delay quickly morphs into permanent exclusion from the democratic process. This agonizing friction does not enter a system entirely through pure malice or intent. It enters completely through flawed, massive structure. And when that massive structure is built entirely upon a totally unverified foundation of risk, the resulting imbalance becomes entirely impossible to ignore. On one side of the political theater, you have an increasingly hysterical claim that continues to falsely grow in urgency. On the other side, you have a cold, hard dataset permanently placed into the record proving extreme rarity, not massive proliferation, just 77 single cases spread over 24 long years. Standing squarely between those two wildly conflicting realities was the director of the FBI, stubbornly insisting that the empirical data was totally wrong, yet completely, hopelessly unable to define what the correct truth actually was. This is not merely a wonky academic dispute over statistics. It is a massive, gaping hole between political assertion and hard evidence. And massive gaps like that entirely refuse to stay contained inside a stuffy committee room. They aggressively follow the law everywhere it goes. Every single senator who votes in favor of that flawed legislation permanently carries that massive logical gap with them directly into their justification. Every public official attempting a desperate defense of the policy must either fully close the void or hopelessly attempt to explain why it does not need to be closed. Because inevitably, at some point, someone will fiercely ask the exact same question again. It won't be from a politician safely sitting in a committee room under oath, but from an ordinary, frustrated citizen at a chaotic town hall or a relentless journalist in a live interview. The conversation absolutely does not end when the time clock officially expires. How many? When that incredibly simple question is asked outside the rigid, protective structure of a congressional hearing, there are absolutely no procedural escape hatches. There are no arbitrary time limits, and absolutely no smooth deferrals to another agency. There is just a raw, unyielding direct expectation that the massive claim being aggressively made can be heavily supported with something completely concrete. If that solid support is still completely absent, the entire debate violently shifts. It is no longer a polite conversation about whether the specific threat even exists. It becomes a fierce, furious interrogation of whether the government's heavy-handed response remotely matches what can actually be empirically demonstrated. That profound distinction is exactly where vital public trust is either permanently solidified or irrevocably shattered. Citizens do not wildly expect flawless perfection from massive institutions, but they absolutely do demand basic, fundamental consistency. They fully expect that the exact same rigorous standard applied in one context is equally applied in another. They demand that hard evidence is not an optional luxury, casually deployed or completely ignored entirely depending on the political convenience of the claim. And when that core expectation is flagrantly violated, even slightly, it violently introduces a persistent doubt. It is not a loud, immediate rebellion, but a quiet, deeply persistent doubt. The kind that permanently lingers every single time a new, terrifying claim is aggressively made by the government. The kind that raises a quiet, unyielding question long before any blind acceptance occurs. Where is the proof? This is the enduring, monumental, long-term impact of what unfolded in this specific hearing. It wasn't just the exchange itself. It was the terrifying precedent it permanently established. It etched into history a profound moment where sheer, unsupported belief was openly and officially substituted for quantifiable facts to justify a sweeping national mandate. It was directly tied to a massive legislative effort that wildly demands absolute compliance on a national scale. Once that terrifying precedent exists, it permanently becomes part of the public evaluation process for absolutely everything that follows. Because the exact next time a sweeping policy is rapidly introduced with intense urgency, terrifying warnings, and wild claims of widespread risk, the memory of this exact moment will completely inform the public. It will dictate exactly how seriously those dramatic claims are taken, how carefully they are fiercely examined, and how quickly they are fiercely resisted. This is exactly how true systemic accountability functions when it operates properly. It doesn't work by magically forcing immediate, satisfying conclusions, but by meticulously preserving the massive logical gap until it is fully addressed. Quigley absolutely did not need to definitively prove that the crisis was a total fabrication. He completely didn't need to thoroughly disprove every single hyperbolic claim being aggressively made. He only needed to brilliantly establish one thing clearly and forever on the official record. He proved that the one person most responsible for aggressively quantifying the threat was entirely, completely incapable of doing so under direct questioning. That singular failure alone permanently shifts the heavy burden of proof. It wildly moves the responsibility directly back to the dramatic claim itself, back to the politicians desperately advancing it, and completely back to the exact place where hard evidence absolutely should have existed from the very beginning, if the scale of the problem truly matched the massive scale of the response. So now, the monumental question stands completely unchanged, entirely unanswered, and vastly more relevant than when it was first asked. If a massive law vehemently demands strict proof from every single citizen, what exact proof exists to fully justify that extreme demand? If this highly publicized threat is truly an existential, massive crisis, where is the hard number that completely defines it? And if that fundamental, essential number simply cannot be produced when it matters the absolute most, what exactly is the foundation supporting everything aggressively built on top of it? If you have closely followed the logic this far, you are absolutely no longer just passively observing a routine congressional hearing. You are bearing witness to exactly how one brilliantly timed, utterly unanswered question can entirely dismantle the foundational architecture of a massive political argument. So, hit the like button if you firmly believe that hard evidence must absolutely come before public policy. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you powerfully draw the line between a necessary law and an unverified burden. Share this deep dive everywhere so more citizens can witness exactly what was explicitly said under oath, and vastly more importantly, what was spectacularly, entirely absent. And absolutely, be sure to subscribe for the next analytical breakdown, because the final vote on this sweeping legislation may very well happen today.